From bustling cities to distant countries, and even the quietest corners of the world, welcome to the Poirot investigation, where long-buried secrets resurface and hidden truths quietly insist on being heard. I'm your host, and it's a genuine pleasure to have you with me this evening for a new mystery. Death wears a silk dressing gown. Stories such as these have a curious way of drawing us together, across borders, across time, and into moments of thoughtful stillness, no matter where we happen to be listening from. Before we begin, do share with us in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. Your city, your country, or simply your own small corner of the world. I read every comment, and it's always rather wonderful to see just how far these tales travel. If you enjoy intelligent mysteries, slow-burning suspense, and truths that simply refuse to remain hidden, do consider subscribing. New investigations await you each day here on the Poirot Investigation. Now then, make yourself comfortable. Perhaps pour a warm cup of tea, or coffee if you prefer, and settle in as we quietly step into tonight's story. Chapter 1, Order in the Snow. Hercule Poirot stood very still in the entrance hall of the Edelweiss Kurhaus and allowed the sensation of disorder to wash over him. It was not, he observed, a visible disorder. On the contrary, everything was arranged with an almost tyrannical precision. The parquet floor gleamed, the rugs lay at exact angles, the air was warm, faintly scented with pine and disinfectant, and carried the oppressive promise of good health enforced at any cost. And yet, something was wrong. Poirot's fastidious moustaches quivered slightly as he removed his gloves and aligned them together in his pocket. Order, he knew, was not merely a matter of surfaces. True order existed in the harmony between people, habits, and expectations. Here, that harmony had been disturbed, though the furniture remained obedient. The avalanche, of course, had much to answer for. He had arrived at the Kurhaus 3 days earlier, armed with a letter from a well-meaning London physician who had assured him that mountain air, regulated meals, and steam treatments would be most beneficial. Poirot had accepted the prescription with polite skepticism. He had long suspected that doctors, like criminals, preferred simple explanations. The avalanche had come on the second night, an ominous, distant thunder that rolled across the valley like a warning deliberately ignored. By morning, the mountain roads were buried, the telephone lines uncertain, and the guests politely imprisoned. Poirot did not object to confinement. Indeed, he often found it clarifying. What troubled him now was the mood. As he surveyed the hall, he noted the staff moving with exaggerated quietness, the way glances were exchanged and then withdrawn. Tranquillity? Yes, but strained, brittle, as though it might shatter if handled carelessly. Poirot was about to inquire after his tisane when the manager approached him, his smile perfectly calibrated and entirely false. "Monsieur Poirot," he said softly, "forgive me. There has been a regrettable occurrence." Poirot inclined his head. Regrettable occurrences are often the most interesting kind. The manager hesitated, then lowered his voice further. "One of our guests has died." Poirot's dark eyes sharpened. "Indeed. And was this death anticipated?" "No, monsieur." "Ah," said Poirot gently. "Then we must be precise. Unexpected deaths demand attention to detail." The manager gestured toward the corridor. "It is Mrs. Fensham. Dr. Weiss is with her now." Poirot followed without haste. Hastiness, he knew, was the enemy of clarity. Suite 14 was situated at the end of a long, well-carpeted corridor, a position of quiet privilege. Poirot took in this detail with interest. People who chose such rooms rarely did so by accident. Inside, the air was warm and heavy. Steam lingered faintly, curling like an afterthought from the open bathroom door. Mrs. Octavia Fensham sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her posture erect, her hands folded with meticulous care. She wore a pale grey silk dressing gown of excellent quality, tied neatly at the waist. Everything about her suggested authority, even in stillness. Poirot approached, his expression grave. "She has the air of a woman who expected to be obeyed," he murmured. Dr. Leonhard Weiss looked up from his examination. "You know her, monsieur?" "Not personally," Poirot replied. "But such women announce themselves, even in death." He leaned slightly closer, careful not to touch. There was no sign of struggle, no disorder, no panic etched into the features. Too peaceful, Poirot thought. Then he noticed it, the faintest sharpness beneath the steam and soap. He inhaled delicately. "Bitter almonds," he said. Dr. Weiss stiffened. "Yes, I thought so too." Poirot straightened. "Then we are not dealing with nature, but with intention." The family waited nearby, arranged by circumstance rather than affection. Poirot observed them with professional courtesy. The daughter-in-law, Celia Fensham, stood very straight, her hands clasped together with unnecessary firmness. Her face was pale, controlled, and carefully empty. The grandson, Rupert Fensham, hovered near the door, his expression restless, his eyes darting from the body to the room and back again as though measuring consequences. The niece, Miss Isabel Crane, sat quietly, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her aunt, with an intensity that suggested long practice. Poirot registered each detail and stored it away. "Who discovered the body?" he asked. "Nurse Greta," Dr. Weiss replied. "Mrs. Fensham failed to attend her steam treatment at 9. Poirot nodded. "A woman of strict habits, then?" "Implacably so," said the manager. Poirot smiled faintly. "Such habits are most useful, to the detective, if not always to the family." He turned back to the body. "There is no sign of force," he said. "She was seated comfortably. The poison was administered in a manner that did not alarm her." Celia Fensham spoke at last. "But she was well. She complained, of course, but—" "Complaints," said Poirot gently, "are not symptoms." Dr. Weiss cleared his throat. "There is something else, monsieur. A small bottle is missing from the medical cabinet." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Prescribed to Mrs. Fensham?" "No." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Excellent. A misplaced object that does not belong. Already the little grey cells are intrigued." He walked slowly around the room, noting the arrangement of papers on the writing desk, the untouched tea tray, the precisely aligned furniture. "This room," he said, "has not been disturbed. That is significant. Either the crime required no struggle, or someone was most careful." Rupert shifted his weight. "Are you saying—" Poirot raised a hand. "I am saying nothing yet, monsieur. The facts must speak first." Outside the window, snow fell steadily, transforming the world into a white enclosure. Poirot turned to the manager. "The roads remain blocked?" "Yes, monsieur." "No one may leave?" "No." Poirot nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then we have time and privacy." He looked once more at Mrs. Octavia Fensham. "A woman who governed through fear and dependence," he said softly. "Such power creates many obligations and many resentments." He turned back to the room, his expression composed, his mind already working. "The Kurhaus," he concluded, "was designed for rest, but where there is enforced tranquillity, there is often rebellion." Outside, the avalanche held its grip. Inside, Hercule Poirot had begun his work. Chapter 2: The Tyranny of Routine. Hercule Poirot believed profoundly in routine. Not merely because it comforted him, though it did, but because routine, when examined closely, was a tyrant that tolerated no deviation. People bent themselves to it, justified themselves by it, and, when convenient, attempted to hide behind it. For the detective, routine was a map. One needed only to see where the lines failed to meet. On the morning following Mrs. Octavia Fensham's death, Poirot took his breakfast alone at a small table near the window. He arranged his coffee, toast and boiled egg with exacting care, observing the dining room over the rim of his cup. The atmosphere had changed. Conversation was subdued but strained, like a badly tuned instrument. Guests spoke too deliberately, paused too often. The staff moved with professional calm, but their eyes flickered towards Suite 14, and then away again. Poirot buttered his toast precisely. Fear, he reflected, was already at work, not the vulgar fear of danger, but the refined fear of implication. When he had finished, he summoned the manager and requested a copy of the Kurhaus timetable. "It is most strict, monsieur," the manager said apologetically. "Identical each day." "Perfect," Poirot replied. "Human beings are rarely identical each day. That is where the interest lies." He retired to the small reading salon, a room designed for silence and seldom used properly, and laid out the schedule before him. Breakfast, 8 to 8:30. Steam treatments, 9 to 10. Rest period, 10 to 12. Luncheon, 12:30. Afternoon walks or therapies by prescription. Poirot tapped the paper lightly. "Mrs. Fensham attended her steam treatment daily at 9, he murmured, "and yesterday she did not." He rang the bell. Nurse Greta arrived promptly, her expression composed, but tired. "Sit, mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly. "You were the first to see Mrs. Fensham that morning." "Yes, monsieur." "Tell me, was her routine ever broken?" Greta hesitated. "No, never. If she was delayed even by minutes, she rang for me. Yet on that morning, she rang for no one." "No, monsieur?" Poirot nodded. "Did anyone else have access to her suite before 9? "Only family, monsieur, and staff, of course." "Of course," said Poirot. "And the steam room, was it prepared as usual?" "Yes, heated from 8:30. Poirot leaned back. "Then if poison was administered, it was likely before that time, before breakfast perhaps, or during." He dismissed the nurse with thanks and summoned Dr. Weiss. The doctor arrived briskly, already defensive. "You believe the poison was cyanide?" Poirot said. "I do." "In what form?" Dr. Weiss hesitated. "Liquid would be simplest, possibly introduced into a drink." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes. Simplicity is always attractive to the criminal." "And the missing bottle?" Dr. Weiss continued. "Contained what?" Poirot asked. "A sedative," Dr. Weiss admitted, "prescribed to another guest." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Which guest?" Dr. Weiss cleared his throat. "Mr. Rupert Fensham." Poirot thanked him and requested that the family be seen individually. Celia Fensham came first. She entered the salon with composed grace, her mourning discreet and tasteful. She sat when invited, folding her hands carefully. "You depended upon your mother-in-law financially," Poirot observed gently. Celia did not flinch. "Yes. And yet dependency does not always breed affection." "No," Celia said quietly. "It breeds caution." Poirot inclined his head. "Where were you yesterday morning before 9? "In my room, resting." "Alone?" "Yes." Poirot smiled politely. "A common answer. Did Mrs. Fensham summon you that morning?" "No." "And did you visit her the night before?" "Yes, briefly." "What was her mood?" Celia paused. "Unpleasant." Poirot nodded. "That too is consistent." Rupert Fensham was less composed. He paced the room before sitting, crossing and uncrossing his legs. "You were prescribed a sedative," Poirot said. "Yes." "And where was it kept?" "In the medical cabinet." "Which is now missing one bottle." Rupert flushed. "You're not suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Poirot interrupted mildly. "I observe." "Where were you yesterday morning?" Poirot asked. "At breakfast. Then I went for a walk on the terrace." "Alone?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes flicked to Rupert's hands. They trembled slightly. "Did you visit your grandmother the night before?" "Yes, she was difficult." "In what way?" "She refused me money." Poirot nodded. "That too is consistent." Isabel Crane arrived last. She sat quietly, her posture impeccable. "You cared for your aunt devotedly," Poirot said. "I did." "And she rewarded you?" Isabel's lips tightened. "She allowed me to be useful." Poirot studied her. "Where were you yesterday morning?" "In the reading room, alone." Poirot smiled gently. Everyone, it seems, was alone. He dismissed her and sat back, steepling his fingers. 3 alibis, based on solitude, a strict timetable, a missing sedative, a poison that killed peacefully. Poirot rose and walked slowly toward the steam room. The tiles gleamed, the benches were arranged with mathematical precision. Steam hissed softly from the vents. Here people relaxed. Here vigilance softened. Poirot inhaled. "Steam," he murmured. "Heat, moisture, a scent easily disguised." He returned to the salon as the afternoon shadows lengthened. One thing was clear. Mrs. Octavia Fensham had not been attacked. She had been assisted. The poison had been given by someone she trusted. Someone who could approach her without arousing suspicion. Someone who knew her routine intimately and how to exploit it. Poirot adjusted his moustaches. "The timetable," he said softly, "is the key. Not where they were, but when they were not." Outside, the snow continued its silent vigil. Inside, Hercule Poirot's little grey cells advanced another step toward order. Chapter 3. Steam and Silence. Hercule Poirot always found that the second day after a death was more revealing than the first. Shock had faded. Formal grief had been arranged and displayed. What remained was irritation, at inconvenience, at delay, at the quiet persistence of questions. It was then that people began to betray themselves, not through grand gestures, but through small lapses in discipline. That morning, Poirot rose early. He dressed with care, smoothing his clothes and attending to his moustaches with almost ceremonial precision. Disorder, he reflected, was contagious. One must guard against it. The Edelweiss Kurhaus had resumed its routine with admirable determination. Breakfast was served promptly. Steam treatments continued as scheduled. Only the absence of one commanding presence made itself felt. Mrs. Octavia Fensham's chair at the dining table remained empty. Poirot took his seat and observed. Celia Fensham arrived precisely at 8, her expression serene, her movements economical. She ate little, but she ate steadily, as if to demonstrate control. Rupert arrived late, glancing about before seating himself, his appetite uncertain. Isabel Crane arrived last, apologetic, her eyes already lowered. Poirot noted it all. After breakfast he rose and approached Rupert. "Monsieur," he said pleasantly, "will you walk with me?" Rupert hesitated, then agreed. They stepped onto the terrace, where the snow lay undisturbed and the valley below was hidden beneath a pale mist. The air was sharp, invigorating, and mercilessly honest. "You do not enjoy confinement," Poirot observed. Rupert laughed shortly. "No, I never have." "And yet you remained close to your grandmother?" Rupert shrugged. "She controlled everything." "Yes," said Poirot. "Control is exhausting for those who wield it and for those who endure it." They walked in silence for a moment. "You were refused money the night before her death," Poirot said. Rupert stopped. "You think that makes me a murderer?" "I think," Poirot replied gently, That motive is like steam. It is everywhere. What matters is who directs it. Rupert's jaw tightened. I didn't poison her. I did not ask if you did. They returned inside. Poirot next sought Isabel Crane. She was in the reading salon, pretending to read a volume she had not turned the page of in some time. Mademoiselle, Poirot said, may I join you? Of course, Monsieur Poirot. You have been indispensable to your aunt. Yes. Indispensable people, Poirot said softly, are often invisible. Isabel's fingers tightened slightly on the book. You were with her often? Daily? You prepared her tea? Yes. And her medicines? Yes. Poirot nodded. A position of trust. Isabel's voice was steady. I loved my aunt. Love, said Poirot, is a word that hides many emotions. He left her then without accusation. Next, Poirot visited the steam room. He did not enter at once. Instead, he stood just outside, observing the attendants as they prepared the room. Towels folded, benches wiped, doors closed and opened in sequence. Routine again. He entered once the room was empty. The steam was thick, clinging to the skin. Scents, soap, eucalyptus, faint traces of perfume hung in the air. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Cyanide, he reflected, was volatile, its scent unmistakable but easily masked in heat and moisture. He examined the water source. The cups provided for guests, the small shelf where personal items were sometimes left unattended. Poirot smiled faintly. It is always the simplest thing, he murmured. That afternoon, Dr. Weiss joined him for tea. You have found something, the doctor said. I have found several things, Poirot replied. But not yet the harmony. The sedative bottle troubles you? Yes, because it is both missing and unnecessary. Dr. Weiss frowned. How so? Sedatives encourage sleep, Poirot said, but Mrs. Fensham was found awake, seated. The sedative was not used to kill her. It was used to facilitate something else. To gain access, Dr. Weiss suggested. Precisely, to ensure compliance, trust. Dr. Weiss hesitated. Isabel Crane often assisted with medications. Poirot nodded. Yes, and she is devoted, but devotion alone does not explain everything. That evening, Poirot requested that all 3 family members attend a small gathering in the salon. They sat, stiff and polite. I wish to speak of routine, Poirot began. Mrs. Fensham was a woman of strict habits. She took her tea at the same hour, attended her steam treatment unfailingly, and disliked surprises. No one spoke. The poison, Poirot continued, was administered without alarm. Therefore it must have been given at a moment she expected, perhaps even welcomed. Celia stirred. You mean her tea? Possibly, Poirot said, or something else equally familiar. He turned to Isabel. You assisted your aunt with her preparations for the steam treatment? Yes, Isabel said quietly. You helped her change. You fetched her dressing gown? Yes, Poirot nodded. And you were alone with her that morning? Isabel hesitated. Yes. Celia looked sharply at her. Poirot raised a hand. Patience, mesdames. We are not yet at the end. He turned to Rupert. You were prescribed a sedative? Yes. And you complained of sleeplessness? Yes. But you did not take it, Poirot said. Rupert frowned. No, it made me feel dull. Poirot smiled. Then the bottle was full. He leaned forward. Someone took it, not to poison, but to ensure that Mrs. Fensham would not resist, would not question, would not notice. Silence thickened. The steam room, Poirot said, was prepared early. Steam masks scent, heat hastens effect. Mrs. Fensham trusted the routine and the person assisting her. Isabel's breath caught. Poirot watched her closely. You loved your aunt, he said gently, But you loved freedom more. Isabel rose abruptly. That's not... Poirot raised his hand again. Not yet. He stood. There is one matter still unresolved, he said. The will. Celia stiffened. Rupert looked sharply up. Poirot smiled slightly. Mrs. Fensham revised it recently, he said. A change was made. One that benefited a person who believed herself invisible. Isabel swayed, gripping the back of the chair. Poirot's voice was calm. Tomorrow, he said, I shall explain everything. Tonight I ask you only this. Reflect upon how routine, once broken, reveals the truth. Outside, the snow began to ease its hold. Inside, silence pressed close and waited. Chapter 4. The Shape of Trust. Hercule Poirot slept poorly that night. It was not anxiety, Poirot rarely indulged in such disorder, but irritation. There remained, in the elegant structure forming in his mind, a single asymmetry. The pieces were present, the motives were sufficient. Yet something in the arrangement lacked balance, and imbalance offended him profoundly. At 7 o'clock, precisely, he rose. Outside, the snowfall had softened, the world remained white and enclosed, but the sky showed a thin promise of movement. The avalanche still ruled the valley, but its tyranny, Poirot sensed, was nearing its end. He dressed carefully and rang for coffee. As he drank it, he reviewed the facts. Mrs. Octavia Fensham, a woman of rigid routine, absolute authority, and calculated dependency. She trusted systems, schedules, and those she had trained to serve her. She did not trust impulses, improvisation, or sentiment. Her death had been tidy. Too tidy. Poirot smiled faintly. Neatness, he murmured, is often a confession. He spent the early morning hours observing rather than questioning. In the corridor outside Suite 14, he noted the pattern of foot traffic. Staff passed frequently, but rarely lingered. The family, however, approached the door with varying degrees of hesitation. Rupert paused once, then moved on. Celia passed without looking. Isabel Crane stood for a long moment, her hand lifted, then withdrew it and retreated down the corridor. Poirot watched her go. At breakfast he observed a subtle but telling alteration. Isabel Crane did not eat. She sat rigidly at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. Celia ate sparingly but methodically. Rupert drank coffee too quickly and left early. Poirot folded his napkin. Fear, he reflected, manifested differently according to temperament. Later that morning, he requested access to Mrs. Fensham's papers. The manager hesitated, but Poirot's reputation, quietly circulated, smoothed the way. In the private sitting room, Poirot examined the writing desk with reverent attention. Mrs. Fensham's correspondence was meticulously ordered, bills paid promptly, letters answered with crisp efficiency. Then Poirot found what he had expected, a memorandum, recently written, precise, legal, a revised will. He did not read it fully at once. Instead, he noted the date, 2 days before the avalanche. "Ah," said Poirot softly. "So," he summoned Dr. Weiss. "This revision, was Mrs. Fensham in good spirits when she made it?" Poirot asked. Dr. Weiss frowned. She was resolved. Did she say why? She said she wished to put matters in order. Poirot smiled. She always did. "And the beneficiaries?" Dr. Weiss ventured. Poirot closed the document. "That, my friend, is the heart of the matter." He requested the family once more. They gathered reluctantly in the salon, tension now openly acknowledged. The illusion of tranquillity had worn thin. Poirot stood before them, hands folded, moustaches immaculately aligned. "I wish to speak of trust," he began. Mrs. Fensham trusted systems. She trusted her timetable, and she trusted, above all, familiarity. She did not fear those close to her because she believed she controlled them. Isabel flinched. On the morning of her death, Poirot continued, Mrs. Fensham followed her routine. She rose. She prepared for her steam treatment. She accepted assistance from the person who always assisted her. He turned his gaze gently toward Isabel. You were with her, mademoiselle? Yes, Isabel said faintly. You prepared her tea? Yes. And her dressing gown? Yes. Poirot nodded. You were indispensable. Celia spoke sharply. Are you accusing her? Poirot raised a hand. No, I am describing a structure. He walked slowly across the room. The sedative was not used to kill, it was used to ensure calm compliance. Mrs. Fensham trusted the routine and the hands that served her. The poison was administered when suspicion was impossible. Rupert spoke suddenly. Why the steam? Poirot turned. Because steam disguises scent, because heat accelerates effect, and because the steam treatment was inevitable. Silence settled. Poirot continued gently. Now we come to motive. Mrs. Fensham revised her will 2 days before her death. Celia stiffened. Rupert leaned forward. Isabel's breath caught. She altered the distribution of her estate, Poirot said, in a way that shocked her family. What change? Rupert demanded. Poirot looked at Isabel. She intended to leave you everything, he said quietly. Isabel stared at him. She believed, Poirot continued, that you alone were loyal, that you alone deserved reward. Celia's face drained of colour. Rupert swore under his breath. Isabel shook her head. No, she wouldn't. She did, Poirot said gently, but she also intended conditions, control beyond the grave, lifelong obligations, no freedom. Isabel's composure fractured. She told me the night before, Isabel whispered. She said I would continue my duty, forever. Poirot nodded, and that was intolerable. Tears welled in Isabel's eyes. I wanted to live. No one spoke. Poirot's voice was kind. You did not intend to kill her violently. You intended release, for yourself. You believed the death would seem natural. Isabel collapsed into the chair. I used the sedative, she said brokenly. Just enough. She trusted me. She drank the tea. She never suspected. Poirot inclined his head. The poison? Celia asked hoarsely. Prepared earlier, Poirot said. Administered with care. Dr. Weiss stepped forward. Poirot raised a hand. There remains one final detail, he said. The timing. He turned to Isabel. You delayed her steam treatment by minutes, enough to ensure solitude, but not enough to cause suspicion. Nurse Greta knocked, too late. Isabel nodded weakly. Poirot straightened. The crime was not one of rage, he said. It was one of resignation. A belief that routine could be bent just once, and then restored. Outside, a distant rumble echoed across the valley. Not an avalanche, but the sound of snow shifting, releasing its hold. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Order, he said softly, has been restored. The illusion of tranquility had shattered, but the truth, at last, stood clear. Chapter 5. After the silence. In the aftermath of confession, the Edelweiss Kurhaus seemed to exhale. Hercule Poirot stood alone for a moment in the reading salon, listening to the faint, newly perceptible sounds of life returning to the building. The clink of crockery, the murmur of voices no longer carefully subdued, the distant hum of machinery as staff resumed their duties with something approaching relief. Order, once fractured, had begun its slow, deliberate reassembly. Poirot adjusted his moustaches. It was never the confession itself that satisfied him, but the quiet that followed, the moment when pretense collapsed and truth, however unwelcome, settled into its proper place. Isabel Crane had been taken to a private room under the supervision of Dr. Weiss. There had been no drama, no hysterics, only exhaustion and a kind of hollow acceptance. She had confessed without embellishment, without defense. The discipline she had cultivated for years had finally turned inward. Celia Fensham had retired to her room, pale and silent. Rupert Fensham had gone out onto the terrace, where the cold air might bite more honestly than his thoughts. Poirot remained. The manager entered quietly. "The local authorities have been informed," he said. "The roads should be cleared by tomorrow." Poirot nodded. "They will find everything in order." "Yes, monsieur." The manager hesitated. "And the guests?" "They will depart," Poirot said. "They always do, even from places that promised improvement." That evening, Poirot took his dinner alone. The dining room felt larger without Mrs. Fensham's presence, as though space had been reclaimed. Her chair had been removed. No one spoke of her aloud, but her absence was the central fact of the room. Poirot ate thoughtfully. He reflected, as he often did, on the nature of control. Mrs. Fensham had governed through routine, obligation, and fear of a loss. In the end, it was her belief in permanence that had undone her. She had assumed that people, like schedules, could be fixed indefinitely. They could not. After dinner, Poirot encountered Rupert in the corridor. The young man looked older now, his restlessness replaced by something heavier. "So it was Isabel," Rupert said quietly. "Yes." Rupert shook his head. She always seemed so harmless." Poirot regarded him steadily. "Harmlessness, monsieur, is often a performance." "She would have inherited everything," Rupert said bitterly. "And yet," Poirot replied, "she would have gained nothing she truly desired." Rupert said nothing. Poirot continued down the corridor. Later he visited Dr. Weiss. "You will testify," Poirot said. "Yes." "You suspected her?" Dr. Weiss sighed. "I suspected everyone, and no one." Poirot smiled gently. That is often the doctor's position. As Poirot prepared for bed, he paused by the window. The snow had thinned. In the distance, lights marked the slow progress of men clearing the road. The mountain, having asserted itself, now permitted passage. He felt no triumph, only resolution. The following morning, the Kurhaus was awakened not by bells or timetables, but by sound, engines, voices, the unmistakable signs of arrival. The police came efficiently with quiet respect for Poirot's work. Statements were taken, evidence collected. Isabel Crane was led away without resistance, her face composed, her eyes fixed ahead. Poirot watched from the vestibule. Celia Fensham passed him, her expression unreadable. "It seems," she said softly, "that we are free." Poirot inclined his head. "Freedom, madame, is a responsibility as much as a relief." She did not reply. Rupert approached last. "You were right," he said, "about routine." Poirot smiled faintly. "Routine tells us who we are, until we change." The roads reopened by noon. Guests departed with polite haste, eager to carry their restored health elsewhere. The Kurhaus returned to its purpose, scrubbed clean of scandal, its serenity repaired like a cracked vase, carefully, and with faint lines still visible. Poirot packed his belongings with care. As he prepared to leave, the manager approached once more. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "we are in your debt." Poirot waved the sentiment aside. "No, monsieur, you are in debt only to the truth. It always collects." He stepped outside. The air was clear. The mountains stood indifferent and eternal. Poirot took a deep breath. "Health," he murmured, "is sometimes restored not by steam, but by clarity." With that, Hercule Poirot descended from the Edelweiss Kurhaus, leaving behind a place that had promised tranquility and delivered instead the revelation that peace enforced is never peace at all. Chapter 6. The Balance Restored. Hercule Poirot had always maintained that the end of a case was as important as its beginning. It was not enough that the truth be revealed, it must also be placed gently, precisely, into the lives it had disturbed. Otherwise, disorder lingered like dust in a neglected corner. On the morning after the authorities departed, the Edelweiss Kurhaus felt altered, yet oddly lighter, as though a pressure long endured had finally been released. The routine remained, the bells rang, the meals were served, the steam hissed dutifully. But something in the air had changed. The guests, fewer now, moved with a freedom that surprised even themselves. Poirot observed this from a corner table in the reading salon, where sunlight fell cleanly through the tall windows. He had declined further medical treatments. "My nerves," he had explained politely, "require no improvement." The manager approached with a sheaf of papers. "Monsieur Poirot, the police have concluded their preliminary report. They are most impressed." Poirot accepted the papers without looking at them. "Impressed," he said mildly, "is a sentiment best reserved for art and architecture. There is also," the manager continued, "the matter of Mrs. Fensham's estate." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the will. Yes, the revision has been confirmed." "And the beneficiaries?" The manager hesitated. "Mrs. Fensham's original will has been reinstated." Poirot nodded. "As I expected." The revised will, he knew, would never take effect. Isabel Crane's inheritance had been conditional, binding her forever to the role she had sought to escape. In attempting to secure freedom through inheritance, she had destroyed the very instrument of her confinement. "The law," Poirot murmured, "is sometimes wiser than people." Later that morning, Poirot encountered Celia Fensham in the winter garden. She stood among the potted evergreens, her gloved hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her posture elegant but no longer rigid. She seemed diminished, and yet, somehow, steadier. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I wish to thank you." Poirot inclined his head. "Gratitude is unnecessary, madame." "Nevertheless," Celia continued, "you have ended something that dominated my life." Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "And now?" Celia's lips curved faintly. "Now I must decide what to do with the rest of it." Poirot smiled. "That is the most difficult investigation of all." She laughed softly, an unfamiliar sound but not an unwelcome one, and moved away. On the terrace, Rupert Fensham sat alone, gazing out over the valley. Poirot joined him without ceremony. "You will inherit now," Rupert said without looking up. "Yes," Poirot replied. "Inheritance is a curious thing. It gives and it binds." Rupert sighed. She controlled everything. Even from the grave she nearly managed it. "Nearly," Poirot agreed, "but not quite." Rupert turned to him. "Do you think Isabel meant to kill her?" Poirot considered. "Intent," he said slowly, "is not always singular. She intended release. She intended silence. Death followed." Rupert nodded. "I never saw it." Poirot looked at him kindly. "We rarely see the invisible." By afternoon, Poirot had completed his packing. He paused before closing his suitcase, examining the objects within, neatly folded clothes, carefully placed toiletries, the small comforts of habit. Order, he reflected, was not merely aesthetic, it was moral. As he prepared to leave his room, Nurse Greta appeared at the door. "Monsieur Poirot," she said shyly, "I wished to say thank you." "For what, mademoiselle?" "For noticing," she said simply. Poirot smiled warmly. "It is my profession." The carriage arrived at 4. Poirot descended the steps of the Kurhaus slowly, taking one last look at the building, perched against the mountain like a jewel set too tightly. The snow had melted in patches, revealing dark stone beneath, evidence of endurance rather than purity. As the carriage set off down the cleared road, Poirot reflected on the case with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Octavia Fensham had believed in absolute control. She had believed that love could be measured, that loyalty could be owned, that routine could preserve power indefinitely. In the end, it was precisely this belief that had isolated her. Isabel Crane, too, had believed in absolutes, freedom or servitude, escape or annihilation. She had chosen a path that led to neither. Poirot sighed softly. "The tragedy," he murmured, "is not the crime, but the certainty." The carriage descended into the valley, leaving the Kurhaus behind. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, allowing his thoughts to settle. Another case concluded, another imbalance corrected. And yet, as always, he knew that the world would soon present him with another disorder, another arrangement of human weakness and misplaced trust. Such was the nature of things. But for now, there was only the road, the clear air, and the comforting assurance that truth, once revealed, had restored its rightful place. Hercule Poirot smiled faintly. Order, at least for the moment, had been achieved. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Snow. Hercule Poirot had learned over the years that conclusions did not end with departures. They lingered, even as the carriage wound its way down the mountain road, leaving the Edelweiss Kurhaus behind like a white thought dismissed from the mind. Poirot felt the case remain with him, not as a puzzle unresolved, but as a pattern whose consequences would continue to unfold long after the investigator had gone. He sat very upright, gloved hands folded over his walking stick, and regarded the landscape with mild approval. The mountains were indifferent to human arrangements. Snow fell, melted, fell again. Control here was an illusion that nature tolerated only briefly. Poirot approved of this honesty. At the small railway station in the valley, he disembarked with care. Porters hurried forward, luggage was retrieved. The bustle of ordinary life resumed, a little clumsily at first, as though unsure whether it had permission. Poirot took a seat in the waiting room. He ordered coffee. It arrived too hot, too bitter, and without ceremony. He sipped it anyway. In the Kurhaus, order had been imposed like a uniform. Here, it emerged naturally from habit and necessity. People came and went, no one whispered, no one pretended serenity. Poirot reflected that this perhaps was the difference between peace and tranquillity. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Monsieur Poirot?" He looked up. It was Dr. Leonhard Weiss. The doctor removed his hat, looking suddenly less authoritative and more human in the plain light of the station. "I did not expect to see you here," Poirot said. "I accompanied Isabel Crane as far as the city," Dr. Weiss replied quietly. "The authorities wished a statement at the regional office." Poirot nodded. "And now?" "Now I return," said Dr. Weiss. "The Kurhaus continues." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "Does it?" Dr. Weiss smiled. But it did not reach his eyes. It must. They sat together for a moment. "She was not evil," Dr. Weiss said abruptly. Poirot inclined his head. "No, nor was Mrs. Fensham. That is what makes it instructive." Dr. Weiss considered this. "Do you think she regrets it?" Poirot paused. "Regret requires imagination. She has always lived within narrow walls. Now they are narrower still." The doctor sighed. "I prescribed rest, silence, routine." Poirot smiled gently. "You prescribed what the Kurhaus believes in. That is not always the same as what people need." The train's whistle echoed faintly in the distance. Dr. Weiss rose. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot." "Au revoir, Doctor." When the doctor had gone, Poirot finished his coffee and rose. The journey home was unremarkable. That, too, he approved of. Several weeks later, in London, Poirot sat in his familiar armchair, letters arranged neatly upon his desk. One bore the handwriting of Celia Fensham. He opened it carefully. She wrote with restraint and clarity. The estate had been settled. She had received her portion, modest but sufficient. Rupert had inherited the remainder. The Kurhaus had already resumed its reputation for restorative calm. "I find," she concluded, "that silence is more pleasant when one is free to break it." Poirot folded the letter. Another envelope followed, this one from a solicitor in Switzerland. It confirmed what Poirot already knew. The revised will had been nullified, entered into evidence, and dismissed as a document created under emotional pressure and undue influence. Poirot nodded. Justice, though imperfect, had done its work. A final letter remained. It was unsigned. The handwriting was careful, controlled, and unfamiliar. It spoke of routine, of obedience, of fear mistaken for loyalty, of a moment, brief, irreversible, in which freedom had seemed possible. Poirot read it twice, then he placed it carefully in a drawer. Not all confessions, he knew, were meant for the authorities. Some were addressed only to the little grey cells of a man who understood. That evening Poirot dined with friends. They spoke of politics, of theatre, of the persistent inadequacy of modern coffee. Someone mentioned a recent scandal, another spoke of a holiday ruined by rain. Poirot listened politely. When asked about his stay in the Alps, he smiled. "Refreshing," he said. Later, as he prepared for bed, Poirot stood for a moment before the mirror. He adjusted his moustaches. Order restored, he reflected, not in the world, which would never submit to such ambition, but in one small corner of it, for one brief time. That was enough. As he extinguished the light, snow began to fall softly outside his window, though here it did not imprison or accuse. It merely covered gently and without judgment. Poirot slept, and somewhere, far away, the Edelweiss Kurhaus continued its routines, bells ringing, steam rising, guests arriving with their ailments and expectations, unaware that tranquillity, once enforced too rigidly, could still echo with the memory of silence broken. The case was over. But its lesson remained. To Chapter 8. The Quiet Geometry of Lives. Hercule Poirot awoke the following morning with the agreeable sensation of having slept exceptionally well. This, he considered as he lay for a moment regarding the ceiling, was not a trivial achievement. Sleep, like order, required conditions. It demanded a mind at peace with itself, or at least one that had placed its troubles in proper compartments. He rose, performed his toilette with unhurried care, and selected a tie of discreet elegance. There would be no investigations today, no disruptions, merely the civilized business of living. Yet experience had taught him that the echoes of a case often revealed themselves when the mind was no longer actively searching. At breakfast, Poirot read the newspaper with polite detachment. The world, as usual, was in a state of mild chaos, political unrest abroad, a financial scandal nearer home, an article praising the curative virtues of Alpine air. Poirot smiled faintly into his coffee. After breakfast he went for a walk. London in winter possessed a dignity of its own. The streets were busy but purposeful, the parks subdued rather than barren. Poirot walked slowly, cane in hand, observing faces, gestures, the choreography of strangers passing one another without collision. Order again, he reflected, not imposed, but negotiated. His thoughts returned, as they inevitably did, to the Edelweiss Kurhaus. Not to the crime itself, that puzzle had been neatly solved, but to its shape. The geometry of relationships, the angles of dependence and power. Mrs. Octavia Fensham had believed that she stood at the center of all lines. In truth, she had forced them inward, compressing lives until resistance became inevitable. Poirot paused on a bench and sat. He thought of Isabel Crane. Confinement, Poirot knew, did not always announce itself as cruelty. Sometimes it wore the face of duty, of gratitude, of familial obligation sanctified by repetition. Isabel had not been chained, she had been scheduled, and schedules, when absolute, were among the most merciless instruments of control. Poirot sighed softly. He had no illusions about the justice of the outcome. A life had been taken, consequences had followed, yet the human cost, as always, exceeded the legal resolution. That afternoon, Poirot received a visit. Captain Hastings entered the sitting room with his customary enthusiasm, removing his hat and beaming. "My dear Poirot, back from the mountains already?" Poirot smiled. "I find that snow, mon ami, is best appreciated in moderation." Hastings laughed and seated himself. "You look remarkably well." "Order," Poirot replied, "is excellent for the digestion." They spoke for a while of inconsequential matters. Hastings, as ever, was eager for a story. "And did anything interesting happen?" he asked at last, attempting casualness. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "Yes," he said, "something interesting did happen." Hastings leaned forward. Poirot shook his head gently. "But not today. Today I prefer to speak of other things." Hastings looked mildly disappointed, but did not press. He had learned over time that Poirot revealed his cases according to an internal schedule known only to himself. After Hastings departed, Poirot returned to his correspondence. Among the letters was one from Switzerland, forwarded from the Kurhaus. It was brief. The manager wrote to inform him that the establishment had introduced certain changes. Timetables had been relaxed. Guests were now encouraged to make personal choices regarding treatments. A new emphasis on individual well-being had been adopted. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Change, he reflected, often arrived quietly, disguised as improvement. He folded the letter and placed it aside. As evening fell, Poirot sat once more by the fire, hands folded, mind calm. He thought of the many cases he had known and of the pattern they shared. Murder, he had long since concluded, was rarely born of passion alone. It was cultivated, encouraged by imbalance, by the slow erosion of dignity, by systems that valued obedience over humanity. Mrs. Fensham had believed she provided security. In truth, she had demanded surrender. Isabel Crane had believed she sought freedom. In truth, she had chosen destruction. Between those two certainties lay the quiet tragedy of inevitability. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "The little grey cells," he murmured, "observe, but they do not judge." Later, as he prepared for bed, Poirot paused once more before the mirror. He adjusted his moustaches with habitual precision. Balance, he reflected, was not the absence of tension. It was the correct distribution of it. Life required space to move, to breathe, to air. When it was denied that space, something always gave way. Poirot extinguished the light. Outside, London continued its murmured existence, carriages, footsteps, voices rising and falling, not tranquil perhaps, but alive. He slept, and far from the city in the mountains, the Edelweiss Kurhaus continued its days, bells ringing less strictly, steam rising less commandingly, guests arriving with ailments both real and imagined. Some would find rest, some would find discomfort, but none, Poirot hoped, would mistake control for care again. The snow would fall, the snow would melt, and the quiet geometry of lives would shift imperceptibly toward balance once more.